So we've started season 3 of our podcast, Women Ending War, run by me, Jewish American Israeli woman, and my co-hosts, Palestinian citizens of Israel. We come from very different worlds, and we share a deep desire for peace and shared society, and a belief that it's possible in this blood-soaked land, really pained, traumatized land with 7 to 8 million Palestinians and 7 to 8 million Jews, all in the same space from the river to the sea, effectively. We share this belief, along with many other people who we've been interviewing, that a solution is possible. There are 164 organizations, Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian organizations, some binational organizations, that share this belief and that are working on it in different ways. And we've been meeting many of the people involved in this kind of work, which is often hopeful and inspiring, and at other times jarring for all of the trauma that we witness, and at other times really, really challenging. I don't usually share just how challenging this work is, but I'd like to take a minute here, now that we're launching season 3 now, and we've already done about 4 recordings so far, 5 for this season. I'd like to share some of what I experience. A little bit. I once made a video about the use of the word genocide. Twice, actually. I made videos about the use of the word genocide and why I don't correct that. And I talked about the idea of connect before you correct. So I'd like to delve into that a little bit more, because there I explained why, I don't see myself as someone whose job it is to correct my co-hosts or my guests when it comes to their sharing of their experiences. But that's not necessarily easy for me or simple. And it involves a lot of looking at my own self. It involves looking at my own history. I do a lot of that work. Because I'm trying to sort of correct elements of my own socialization and my own upbringing. That's the subject of my book that just came out a few weeks ago, In My Jewish State. It's where I share how I was brought up, into religious Zionism, and into a lot of the rhetoric that drives Ben Gvir and Smotrich and that whole world. I was brought up into that. I dedicated my life to that for a while. I moved to Israel when I was 23 years old, a young religious mother, married religious mother with my head covering and my long skirts. I did all that. And then it took me quite a process. It took me 20 years or more of processing and undoing and learning to think for myself. So, so part of what I'm doing is to repair the cultures that I was socialized into, for myself as well as for my surroundings, and share what I believe to be our better values, having to do with empathy and humanization, as opposed to tribalism and military force and violence. So I'm trying to share all of that, and I'm trying to also repair some really terrible things that are happening. I am very deeply horrified by what the IDF in Israel has been doing in Gaza for the last 15 months, but also in the West Bank. The more you learn of it, the more you see of it, the more you are willing to open your eyes and see beyond the heavily censored Israeli media, and look beyond that and see what's really going on. If you look at it with an open heart and an open mind, you can't really unsee it. And so part of me wants to do that repair also, to really speak out about injustice and to speak to my own people and the place where I come from. So that is a lot of what motivates me. But sometimes it's hard. So there were 2 particular experiences in season 2 in different directions that were both really challenging. The first experience was when I brought Eva on October 7th. It was actually went like literally, it was like October 6th or something like that. It was really important for me that we revisit the location of the massacre of October 7th. Okay, October 7th was this awful massacre, and it created this massive trauma in Israeli society that a lot of Jews have taken to places of, Holocaust remembrance, and that also left us with hostages, 250 hostages, which was an insane thing that's still going on. There are still 70 something hostages there. The conditions of the ones left are awful, horrifying. We hear stories about hostages there sitting in chains for 15 months without being fed, being hung upside down, having torture, physical and psychological torture, sitting in tunnels, not knowing what season it is, not knowing day or night. So we're hearing these stories and we see, we've seen the pictures of the hostages. So this is really hard, and this is a serious trauma, and it's also a massive emotional trauma, as John Pollan Goldberg, the father of the one of the hostages, Hirsch Pollan Goldberg, who was killed in August, he often spoke about this, about how the price of not bringing the hostages back was a price on our souls as the Jewish people, as no longer being able to say about ourselves that we value life above all else. And that is very real. And this, watching our own government not care enough to bring the hostages back, and followers of the government also screaming and attacking hostage families. I mean, this is a massive, massive trauma. But this particular trauma began on October 7th. And it was really important to me to bring Eva to that spot, to go to where the Nova Festival happened, and to speak to some of the evacuees. And we went to interview a woman, Roni Kedar, a lifelong peace activist, an 80-year-old peace activist who had been, she was from from Nativ HaAsara, which was very directly hit on October 7th, and she lost friends, and her daughter left Israel, and she had neighbors who were taken hostage, and she herself is no longer living in her home. And so first Eva and I went to the Nova Festival site, where we listened to the idea of bombing Gaza. We felt the bombing in our bones. And then we went to speak to Roni Kedar. And while we were there, Roni was sharing her stories, but at a certain point in the interview, Eva took over with her story. And the reason why Eva took over was because we asked Roni what she thinks about what's going on in Gaza, and she said something about proportionality, meaning what she didn't say was, "I'm against what's happening in Gaza." And for Eva, that was a trigger to say, how can you say that? Because Eva has family in Gaza. A lot of her family members have been killed and other things. And so that was really hard for her to hear. But what ended up happening is that instead of us finishing hearing Roni, we shifted to Eva. I regret that I didn't step in a little bit better there. I was also sort of surprised when Roni said the comment about proportionality. That was really hard for me also. But I didn't try to fix the dynamic that had just happened. And I regret that, because I think that what we did there was wrong. In other words, not keeping space on Roni and instead taking this position of correction. It was sort of like, in all my, desire to connect before I correct, right? I've talked about this also, that the approach that I take is connect before you correct. It comes from nonviolent communication, the world of NVC, nonviolent communication. It's one of the ground rules of nonviolent communication is connect before you correct. And I take that very seriously, which is why I don't comment on uses of the word genocide and ethnic cleansing. Also because I'm not sure it's wrong. Like, I think it's very possible that what's happening now is genocide and ethnic cleansing, and so when Palestinians describe genocide, ethnic cleansing, I hold space for that. I'm not correcting it, because I'm not correcting that. So I do the connect before you correct. And yet when it came to the interview with Ronnie, I didn't, meaning that I I held space for Eva to tell her story of 1947 and all of that, where effectively she was correcting Ronnie. And I could see on Ronnie's body language that she stopped talking, she stopped sharing. After the interview, I reached out to Ronnie a few times and I apologized and stuff, but the damage was done because she's a woman who had experienced immense trauma. And I came to her with the pretense of saying, we want to hear about your trauma. And instead, we ended up focusing on Eva's story of 1947 and what happened to her family. So that has stayed with me in a really troubling way. Like, I really don't feel good about that. And I can't really fix it. What's done is done. I don't, I apologized to Ronnie and I reached out to her and stuff, but, there's only so much you can do to undo that. Then we had, a reverse kind of, but the same kind of situation where, Eva and I talked about this in the introduction to season 3. We had this. It wasn't the introduction to season 3. Sorry, it was the final episode we did for season 2. We had a 25-minute conversation about what happened with a Palestinian woman from Gaza who I interviewed. I interviewed her alone. Eva couldn't make it that time. She lives in Costa Rica, and she comes back and forth to Israel, Palestine. And so sometimes I do things myself. Sometimes I do it with my other co-host, Fahira. The co-hosting is a dynamic situation because of lots of movement and other things. So when we had this opportunity to interview this Palestinian woman whose name I don't want to say, let's call her Amal, okay, just to give her a name. Amal. I interviewed Amal, and she doesn't live in Gaza. She moved out 6 years ago, but her whole family is still there. And she shared with us some really awful things that her family has gone through. So much death, so much moving around. They had to move around 4 different times. Her family home was destroyed. A 4-generation family home was destroyed. She said there are so many people who are dying all the time that they don't even have time to mourn or to bury people properly. Um, Immense trauma. And we had agreed in advance. We had sort of done a practice run of the conversation, and we agreed on certain topics. And then when it came to the final recording, I threw in another question that hadn't been planned, which is I said, what do people of Gaza think about the hostage situation? Like that, in that tone of voice. I didn't do an attacking tone of voice. It was just a curiosity question, but it was a curiosity question that took a particular perspective, a particular Israeli perspective, and sort of deviated from her telling her story. It was kind of like a mirror image of what I felt like Eva had done to Ronnie, I had just done to Amal. Um, I immediately realized, she said, I don't want to answer that. And I said, you're right, I'm really sorry. And, but again, the damage was done. We finished the interview. We continued with the other questions, but you could tell from her body language that she was no longer feeling safe. So afterwards, I apologized again and I said, well, let's delete that section. Can we still put the rest of the interview up? And she said no. And she was, very, upset about this. And Eva was also very upset. She was on Amal's side, and she felt a little bit, I think maybe a little bit also betrayed by me, by the fact that I asked a question that we hadn't agreed on that represented a perspective of the other. So both of these stories were hard, and both of these reflect limits of dialogue, that there are that limits of dialogue in the sense that you have to be like super sensitive here because of all of the trauma, tons and tons of trauma. And also there are like power dynamics here. For Amal, I was the power and she was the powerless, like that. So, it's hard for a lot of Jews to hear that. Jews often, we think of ourselves as the powerless. We're only 13 million people in the world as opposed to, hundreds of millions of Muslims. We have one tiny look. There are a lot of ways that Jews, we have a narrative of vulnerability and victimhood and anti-Semitism and all that. But that is not exactly the case in Israel. In Israel, the Jews in Israel are the governing majority. and we have the power and we are the dominant group. And in particular, when it comes to Gaza and also the West Bank, the Israeli government and the Israeli army has all the power to completely control and dominate the lives of Palestinians. And we do it often with a lot of cruelty. A lot of cruelty. We are often violating international law, and we do it in a way of sort of justifying it with lots of language of dehumanization, which is what I write about in my book. Okay, all of that language, really, really concerted efforts in the Zionist world that I come from to dehumanize Palestinians in order to justify terrible things. So this is hard for Jews to hear often. It's hard for Israelis to hear about, the fact that we are the power here. We don't like the word colonial. What do you mean we're colonial? We're not the British Empire and all that, which is true. We're not the British Empire, but we still have lots more power. In lots of ways. So for Amal, that was also really triggering for her and really hard. And okay, so, I fully accept that. And, again, I apologize like a zillion times, but it didn't matter. She still didn't want to upload that recording. We might still do it again. We're still in dialogue. We might try to take two on that. We'll see how it goes. Maybe sometime in towards the end of season 3, we'll get a second chance at that. But, this is hard. And, it's also on a certain level hard for me. Also because you know, I am also traumatized. I am deeply traumatized by October 7th, you know, and it is hard also because, every time I mention this, like every time I mention October 7th, hostages, I do get corrected, right? I don't always feel like my co-hosts are as loyal to the connect before you correct dictum that I am. And I often feel, not just my whole co-hosts, I feel from exchange with Palestinians a lot that, Palestinians sometimes say to me or to others, they'll say, October 7th isn't about October 7th. October 7th started in 1947, or October 7th, is brought, whatever likes to say. She says October 7th just brought the entire occupation into the living rooms of Israelis, but it didn't start on October 7th. To be fair, Eva also wasn't here in Israel on October 7th. She was in Costa Rica. So, as opposed to, let's say, Fahira, my other co-host, who was in Israel, who lives in Daliat al Carmel, and she has said very clearly on the podcast, she has said October 7th was a massacre. October 7th was terrible. One of the things that Fahira has said is, and she said it also, she said in season 2, in one of the episodes, she said what was really hard for her was that while she and her community were still mourning, they were also mourning October 7th. And Fahira was dealing a lot with rockets, up north, they were also dealing with rockets, and they were, dealing with all of it while the Ben Gvir was saying, oh, Israeli Arabs, they're all our enemies and stuff, and like Israeli Arabs immediately were turned into the enemy. Already on October 8th, you had mayors in Israel saying that we are never going to hire an Arab again. We're going to make sure our city is Palestinian free, Arab free. And so Fakhira was saying that, like, while she herself was also mourning that terrible massacre of October 7th, so many elements of Israel were already pointing at Arab Israelis as, or Palestinian citizens of Israel as the enemy. So she was describing how hard that was. She goes, they didn't even give us a chance for solidarity. Israelis didn't even give us a chance to be in solidarity. And so, I think about that a lot. And, those are some of the conversations that Fahir and I have had. Well, Eva, tends to say to me, well, October 7th isn't the story here. But for me, October 7th is its own story. And I keep trying to say that, I understand that we have to fix the occupation. And I understand that we have to stop all of these social processes about dehumanization that lead to terrible acts of violence and control. We have to fix that and stop that. Yes, absolutely yes. And also, October 7th was a really bad thing, and a lot of Israelis are still dealing with it. I'm trying to like hold space for both of those things, and it's not always easy. So I want to share one last thing. So I just wanted to share that. Like, I just wanted to share that this podcast is, on the one hand, so important. It's not the podcast that's so important. It's all of it that is so important. It's not just the podcast I'm doing and the book that I'm writing. And, I participate in a lot of groups. I participate in all kinds of solidarity groups and protests and, and I write Substacks and I'm trying and on social media trying to make these arguments all the time and in real life. And I'm also in the middle of a training course to become trained in nonviolent communication with my friends Anat and Nadia, who were in season 1 on episode 4. They're the ones who taught me connect before you correct. And now I'm doing a course training with them in nonviolent communication with multiculturalism. It's a group that's half Jewish Israeli, half Palestinian Israeli. And that course is also challenging in very similar ways. And but so what I'm saying is that, like, it's not just the podcast. The podcast is like one of many places where I try to bring this work to the fore. And I just wanted to share that, on the one hand, it's the most important thing that I have to do, okay, is to participate in this reversing of the pain, of reversing of the violence, of undoing the violence. And at the same time, it's sometimes really hard for me. It's hard for me to balance it all. And one of the things that's hard for me is sort of finding my own place. What does it mean to be Israeli? Is it possible to be an Israeli, Jewish Israeli in the world and be whole with myself, knowing what's being done in my name? I don't know yet. I don't really have a good answer, but I also can't go through life with like endless self-hatred. That's also not helpful. I have to be whole in myself also, and I have to wake up in the morning and be whole with myself and do the work that I need to do to mitigate violence, to end the violence, to end the hatred and all of that. So I'm doing both of those things, and it's like a lot of other people. I don't mean to say, though, it's just me. I'm reflecting, I think, a posture that a lot of other people are struggling with also. So I'm just putting out there that this is hard. Last thing I wanted to share is that I recently watched season 2 of Mo. It's this, in case you missed it, Mo is a comedy, sort of comedy, by a Palestinian American from Houston, born in the West Bank, moved to Kuwait, and then moved to Houston and lived in Houston for 20 something years or something as a not as a stateless person. And so, I mean, it's a fictional sitcom, but based on his life. Like many aspects of it are based on his life. He gave this interview with Jon Stewart where he describes a lot of it. You can find it on YouTube. It's worth watching if you're interested in this. Anyway, one of his, he tells Jon Stewart, he describes it as it's the only Palestinian show on television, meaning he's the only Palestinian who like has his own show in America. So the show is important and his voice is important because he humanizes the experiences of Palestinians in the world. What it means to be Palestinian, how Palestinians are neglected. The Palestinian experiences are neglected. The Palestinian experience of being stateless, of being entityless, of not having a place where they vote, not having a place where they belong. I mean, that's really important. And also explaining his family history of, the migrations and the moving around, and also explaining, his experiences with occupation and with Israel. So all of those perspectives are important. And for the most part, I sympathize and empathize, and I'm listening. Even there was this one scene, there's a little bit of spoiler, but there is this scene which has sort of become a topic of conversation where he's trying to get the American ambassador to Mexico to help him. He's stuck in Mexico. He gets this what he finally has an audience with his ambassador. But the ambassador, and he needs the ambassador so badly to get home. He's been stuck for months. But the ambassador refuses to say the word occupation. And so Mo blows it because he can't bring himself to just accept that the ambassador has a perspective, and the ambassador eventually kicks him out. So he really, he's his need to insist on using the word occupation ruined his life a little bit. So that seems extreme, right? But I've encountered that. I've had similar exchanges also where like, Palestinians have said to me, say the word occupation. And at the same time, I've had experiences with Jews who say, how could you use the word occupation? How could you say such a thing? So, I've heard both sides. There is an occupation. We, Israel, are committing an occupation. It is terrible. It is real. And we need to face this and we need to end it. Yes, that is my belief system. It was, I come from the world that says, how could you use the word occupation? That's so anti-Semitic. That's the world I come from. You see all these people talking about occupation. They just hate Jews and they want all Jews to die. And it's like, no, they just want the occupation to end because the occupation ruins millions of lives. An author that I really love about this, Raja Shahida. He's got a whole series of books, must reads. I recommend these. I've read, I don't know, probably three or four of his books at least. He writes a lot about this, and you just have to like read the stuff and or listen to Palestinians talk to understand what this means. So, so in this series, Mo, I really started out really identifying with him and really understanding how important it is for him to share all this. And even when he was ruining his life with the ambassador by shouting at the ambassador for not using the word occupation, I understood him. I understood it. I understood it because I understand that this practice that we Jews do often, of like just denying somebody else's experience, it's really annoying. It's really annoying. It's arrogant. It's annoying. It's obnoxious. It's self-perpetuating, and it's violent. It's toxic. It's all of those things. And I wish we would stop doing that. I wish we as Jews would like listen, just listen more. Just listen. I feel like so much of the violence could be, would go away if we as the Jewish people would just listen it a little more and stop insisting on our own righteousness all the time. I feel that so strongly. I just feel it so strongly. It's just, okay. But then something in the season 2 changed for me, and I stopped being as sympathetic to Mo. And again, spoilers, but what changed things for me was when they introduced an Israeli character, Guy. Guy, the Israeli guy whose name is Guy. The fact that he was Israeli seemingly gave Mo permission to just hate him, right? There was so much hate for this chef, an Israeli chef living in Houston who dares to serve hummus. They had a whole discussion about cultural appropriation, about food. How could Israelis call hummus Israeli? How could they call couscous Israeli? They had a whole discussion about couscous. I'm okay talking about cultural appropriation and having a debate about that. What I'm really not okay with is blanket hatred of Israelis, of assuming that because someone is Israeli that they deserve to be hated, like despised, like they're not human and there's absolutely nothing good about them. I'm not okay with that. Just as I'm not okay with blanket statements about Palestinians. I spend so much of my life trying to fight blanket statements about Palestinians. So why would I accept blanket statements about Israelis? I don't accept blanket statements about women. I don't accept blanket statements about men. I don't accept blanket statements about people with different color skin or different color eyes or writers or lefties or short people. Okay. And I live my life as a short person. By the way, experience the world as a short person. I'm particularly sensitive about that, but I'm digressing. My point is that I don't I don't accept this idea that we should say, oh, well, they're Israeli, therefore they should be hated. So I noticed that, I registered that, and I kept watching the show. And as the show progressed into the last episodes of season 2, that feeling got worse because, Israelis were shown in their worst, settlers were shown in absolute worst, and in very blanket ways. And all of these blanket statements became just like normalized. So I'm not trying to say that there aren't settlers who are doing very violent things. Settler violence is terrible and it's on the rise and it's not taken care of by this government. And there are some terrible things happening. But that's not to say that, every settler is carrying a gun and that they're all evil and they all want to kill Palestinians, because that is not true any more than it is true that 2.2 million Gazans are all Hamas terrorists. That is not true. And the idea of all settlers being this way is also not true. So those are all bad ways of conceiving of others. The whole point is for us to humanize everyone. So I don't want to dehumanize Jews or settlers or Israelis any more than I want to be dehumanizing Palestinians. The dehumanization of entire groups is wrong. Okay. So the show kept on with that. And that was really, really, really hard for me. And at a certain point, there was something in there which made it sound like all Israelis are Haredim. And there were like some images of Haredim as if to say like, oh, whatever Haredim do, that's what Israelis are. And it's like, wow, that really misses quite a lot of nuances. So, so that was also really hard for me. And I realized when I was like struggling with the show, with the just so much hate. And even if I know where the hate comes from, we have a responsibility not to turn our hate into legitimization of stereotypes and grandiose statements or generalizations about entire groups of people. We have a responsibility as human beings to not let our pains and traumas and our experiences turn into that. That is really hard work, what I just said, okay? That even in our place of trauma, we should not turn into Nazis or whatever. I understand that that can be hard work. Nevertheless, that's the work. That's our work as Jews, as Israelis, and that's also work for Palestinians. All of us as human beings, that is our work, to not allow our pains and traumas to turn into hate that becomes violence based on stereotypes and generalizations. There is another way, and that's what I'm embracing. So what I was saying is that while I was watching the end of the show, I realized that my feelings about Mo and where he took this parallel my feelings about my podcast and some of my exchanges on my podcast about the difficulties, the real challenges of holding space for all of this, of holding space for the other, of acknowledging the real pain, of apologizing for what some of my people are doing in my name. I also believe in apologies, by the way. One of them, I'll tell that story in a second. So um, I'm trying to say that holding space for both is hard, and that in the podcast, it's sometimes been hard for me, and that two-sided feelings of like, on the one hand, wanting to acknowledge all that, but on the other hand, wanting to retain my own right to be treated as a human also, that is not always easy. Sometimes that's really complicated. Now, the last thing I'll say is about the apology, which is that one of, I think, the best moments that Eva and I had was when we did a webinar, not for our podcast. We were invited to do a webinar with a Danish group that does issues of gender and peace. And as part of this joint webinar, which I shared on my YouTube channel, it's there in the middle of season 2, I'm pretty sure. One of the questions that was asked by an audience member was, Eva, what do you need from Elana right now that would help advance reconciliation? And Eva said, I would like an apology. And she talked about the need for an apology, for everything her family has been through. And so I apologized and, laid out my idea. I apologized for everything. Everything. I mean, not everything. Everything's that's wrong. I apologize. You should watch it and look at what the apology was. I'm curious what people think of that. And afterwards, when Eva and I sort of like were debriefing about it, she was like a different person. She was like lighter. And she said that it really meant something to her. Like it really did something to her. And I think about that often. I think about what the power of apology for reconciliation. And there are lots of examples, around the world of politicized apologies, meaning like, whether it's how in Australia they acknowledge Aboriginal lands every time, there've been apologies. Australia, South Africa, there was a whole apology commission kind of thing. The apology as an acknowledgement of wrongdoing is a very powerful tool. And I'm very, very in favor of of working towards that here in Israel. After that, though, I did get an email from someone who was on the call and said, but why didn't Eva apologize to you? And I said, I didn't need it, which was true. I didn't need it. Actually, uh, in that same call before that apology, I had corrected Eva on something. It was the only time in all of our 2+ now in our third season together where I ever violated the whole connect before you correct thing. I leave space. I try really, really hard to leave space. But this time I said I really needed to correct something that Eva said. Eva basically said that in 1947, the entire reason why the Israel was established was because Jews had this desire to annihilate all the Palestinians. She basically said something like that. And I said, that's, too much. That is not true. We were 3 years, and then I started to explain, we were 3 years after the Holocaust. We were still in this incredible, our own trauma. And plus, by the way, 1947, in the partition plan, the Jews accepted the partition plan and the Palestinians didn't. Palestinians, for whatever reason, didn't, but the Jews accepted it, meaning that the Jews were, at the time, very willing to live alongside a Palestinian state. So to say that, oh, Jews were not willing to have Palestinians around was just factually wrong. Anyway, so she said, I misspoke. After she heard me say that, Eva said, I misspoke, which was like, wow. That was like a real wow moment. So, and then afterwards, I apologized to her. But then I got this question, from someone after and said, well, why didn't she apologize to you? And I said, I really didn't need it, which is true. I don't need an apology from Eva, right? She's not hurting me. She's not Hamas. She's never done anything violent in her life. Her whole life is dedicated to peace and therapy and trauma healing and all of that. So I didn't feel, oh, I need Eva to apologize to me. I don't know that reflects how other Israelis might feel. People in the Gaza Rim might feel that they need an apology. People up north might feel that they need an apology. So I'm certainly not speaking for like all Jews or all of Israelis. I'm just saying that that's where I, felt at the moment. But after watching Mo, I sort of shifted a little bit. I felt very like attacked as an Israeli, like, oh, there's no such thing as a good Israeli, basically, and there's no such thing as an Israeli who wants peace or who wants a different, something else. That was just really hard for me. And I started to think, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should be thinking in terms of reverse. Maybe I should be rethinking the whole idea of power relationships. I don't think so. I think I pretty much stand where I said, I don't need an apology. But I know that for a lot of Israelis, peace-loving Israelis, peace-pursuing Israelis, it's not always so easy. And I'd like to acknowledge that. I don't really acknowledge that often in the podcast. Maybe I should acknowledge it more. I'm thinking maybe in season 3, I might shift to be a little more complex or nuanced in some of my understandings. I'm not sure yet, but this is hard. And where I am is not necessarily where everybody else is. But as hard as it is, I do believe that there are solutions. And I believe very, very strongly that there are lots of really good people out there on both sides of on all sides of the conflict who have a different vision and believe in a different possibility. And so I'm sticking with that. I'm hanging on to hope and optimism, despite some really difficult things around us. The new Trump administration and the Trump Bibi bromance are a major, major obstacle right now. But I believe that there are a lot of people who are fighting this with their entire bodies and souls and minds. And I'd like to think that I'm one of those people. I'm in that crowd of people who are fighting this, and we're going to keep going. So I just wanted to share a little bit. I really wanted to just reflect a little bit on the complexities and challenges and share a little bit about what motivates me. And I'd love to hear from you. I would love to hear what speaks to you, what doesn't speak to you, what's challenging for you, what's inspiring for you, what you want more of, what you want less of, what you'd like me to address or not, or what we'd like Eva to address or Fahira, who you'd like me to interview, who'd like us to interview. I'm really interested in hearing all of that. So be in touch with me. You can write to me directly, elana@jewfem.com. That's from my 15-year-old website called The Jewish Feminist, which I don't use so much anymore, but I still use the hashtag, I still use the link. It's elana@jewfem.com or elana.stockman@gmail.com. Write to me or find me on social media. You can find me on Facebook and on LinkedIn and on Bluesky. I know it's supposed to be Blue Sky, but I call it Bluesky. Anyway, okay. Please stay in touch with me. And yeah, let me know your thoughts, your ideas, your insights. Thank you.